Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sunday's Other Scriptures for October 12th. This week is the second week of a series I'm doing on growing faith based on our gospel readings in Matthew 17. Our theme for the day is recognizing Jesus, or I should say, it's actually recognizing God, because our first reading from the Old Testament, which kind of ties in a little bit to our gospel reading, is from the book of Ruth. Now, Ruth was the grandmother of King David, and that's very significant because she was a Moabite. And the Moabites and the Israelites had been commanded not to intermarry with the Moabites because the Moabites had refused to allow the Israelites safe passage through their land when the Israelites were coming to inherit the promised land. But Ruth takes place during the time of the judges, when the Israelites were not very good about paying attention to what God had commanded them. And in fact, there was a lot of chaos in Israel. And it turns out that there was also a drought during that time. And so a couple named Elimelech and Naomi decide that they're going to move to Moab, where apparently there's rain and there's work and they can survive. And so they move to Moab, and while they're there, Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi, his wife, bereft. Now, fortunately, they have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And Mahlon and Chilion marry local girls. They marry Moabite girls. But then Mahlon and Chilion both die, and that leaves Naomi and her two daughters-in-law really in a tight spot because women in those days could not live on their own. They had to be part of a household. The choice really was prostitution, which wasn't an option for anyone who was moral or had any kind of self-respect, or become a servant, which was also a vulnerable position. And so Naomi decides that she is going to go back to where she came from, around the land of Bethlehem, around the town of Bethlehem. And her two daughter-in-laws set out to go with her, but she tells them, look, why are you going with me? Because even if I got remarried today and got pregnant right away and had a boy, would you wait until he grew up and then marry him? No, you should go back to your family, and then you'll have the chance of remarrying. And Orpah, who incidentally, if you're wondering, Oprah Winfrey, her name is a misspelling of Orpah, so it's almost biblical, just like some of the things that Oprah says are almost biblical. Not quite. But Orpah kisses her mother-in-law goodbye, and she goes back to her people in Moab. But Ruth, the other daughter-in-law, says, "No, I'm going to stay with you. I love you. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Which tells us, I think, some things about Ruth, that she's interested in the God of Israel, and she really loves and feels responsibility towards Naomi. She's a really caring person, and it tells us something about Naomi too, that she's the type of person who would have this bond with her daughter-in-law. In fact, Ruth goes on to say, "May the Lord," and she uses the formal name, the personal name for the God of Israel, Yahweh. That's why Lord is all in capital letters. It indicates that the word behind Lord is actually Yahweh. She says, "May Yahweh deal with me ever so severely if I do not stay with you." If she says, "Nothing but death separates you and me," and that is a very serious swearing, a very serious oath in the name of the God of Israel. And so when Naomi hears that, she realizes she has no choice but to take Ruth with her, and they head back to Bethlehem. And that is the beginning of the story of Ruth. And also really in a way the beginning of the story of King David. So that is an example of a foreigner, someone who is despised, a Moabite, nonetheless recognizing and committing to the God of Israel. That's the tie-in with our gospel reading. Now, our psalm for the day is Psalm 111, and in this psalm we have the Lord, Yahweh, being praised and extolled in the council of the upright. and the assembly, the great assembly. So this is someone who's not afraid to speak out loud publicly about the Lord and to praise his works. And the works that are named are his deeds of righteousness. He provides food for those who fear him, so he is gracious and compassionate. He's not just majestic, he's also compassionate. It says he's shown his people the power of his works, and his works are faithful and just. His precepts are trustworthy. It talks about him also, though, giving his people, keeping his covenant with his people and giving them the land forever. Now, you might not think that that's compassionate because they had to drive out the Canaanites. They never did really drive out all the Canaanites, but that's what they were supposed to do. How is that compassionate? Well, what people miss, because it's not said straight out in the Bible, is that the Canaanites were a people who had turned away from God. They were a notoriously wicked people. And even though the Israelites weren't great, nonetheless, God had given the Canaanites time to repent and turn to him, and instead they needed to be driven out, because otherwise their worship of foreign gods, their child sacrifices, their the horrible things they did would be a negative influence on the Israelites. And so, later on in the Old Testament, we find out that's the case. They send their young women to seduce the Israelite men. They seduce the Israelites into worshiping false gods. And all of this trouble comes because they don't actually fulfill that. But nonetheless, God giving them the promised land, the land he had promised to their forefathers, is an act of compassion towards them, giving land to a people who are not a people on the strength of his covenant, his promise to them, not because of what they had done. Which kind of leads us to our epistle reading. We've been doing a series of readings through Paul's writings to Timothy, his young apprentice. This is from the second letter he writes to Timothy, in which he tells Timothy to be strong in the grace of the Christ Jesus. And what he had heard from Paul, he should entrust to reliable witnesses who will be qualified to teach these to others. This is essential. The words that Paul often uses about passing on the gospel, it's not hearsay, it's not an informal thing, it's a formal trust, right? We would say in the world of finance, a fiduciary duty that Timothy has to get the message right and to give the message to people who will get it right and pass it on, so that the Christian faith, the Christian message, won't be corrupted. And Paul uses a series of quick analogies to remind Timothy of his role. A couple of things. One is that he's to be like a soldier who's guarding a treasure. In that, and he should focus on obeying his commanding officer and not being distracted. The second one is that the hardworking farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crops. What does that mean? Well, that means that Timothy shouldn't be afraid to be paid or supported by the congregation so that he can focus on sharing this message, because what he's giving the people is actually even more valuable than the food and support that they're giving back to him. And the one in between was the athlete who doesn't receive the victor's crown unless he competes according to the rules. It's a reminder that Timothy is to have integrity in his role. And then Paul goes on, remember Jesus Christ descended from David. There's a link to our Old Testament. And it's for that gospel that Paul is in chains. He's being persecuted and will eventually be executed for his faithfulness to Christ, for spreading that message. So keep that in mind, Timothy. Not just that might happen to you, but that's how valuable this message is. And then Paul ends this little passage with, endure everything for the sake of the elect. And then he talks about Jesus. If we have died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. It's not just about getting into heaven. It's that God treats us as princes and princesses in his kingdom. And then if we disown him, he will also disown us. But then in this twist at the end, he says, if we are faithless, he will remain faithful, for he cannot disown himself. And this is kind of a connection to the psalm that we had before. It talks about the works of God's hands being faithful and how he remains faithful even though we're not faithful. Now, then we move on to our short gospel reading from Luke. It's Luke 17, in which Jesus is traveling the border between Samaria and Galilee. Galilee in the north is where he came from. Samaria is right here, and then down below is Judah. And this border is between two rival groups, because you might remember the Samaritans were hated by the Jews. They were considered to be heretics because they had been excluded from Israelite worship, and so they had set up their own worship center, and so the Israelites hated them for that. And the reason they were excluded was because when the Israelites were in Babylon, in exile, the Samaritans are descended from those Israelites who intermarried with the other nations that were brought in by the Babylonians to work the land. Against the law of God, they intermarried with foreign nations, and so they were considered to be half-breeds and heretics. The Israelites hated them and so wouldn't let them in the temple. The Samaritans hated the Israelites back, and yet in this story, you have a group that appears to be a mixed group along this border, a mixed group of both Jews and at least one Samaritan. And what brought them together? They're all lepers. They have what we call today Haskins disease. It's this horrible disease where you lose feeling, and like, some diabetics and so on, only worse. In those days, it would cause, your limbs to basically just kind of fall off, often get infected. You would eventually die of it. It badly disfigured people. Their nose would fall off, and they just looked terrible. And because this was such a feared disease, if you had leprosy or even were suspected of having it, you were sent away. You were outcast to a leper colony. And if you didn't have it beforehand, you would get it in this leper colony and interacting with these lepers. And so the lepers were required to shout out if anyone came within 50 paces, "Unclean, unclean!" And people would, they would avoid them like the plague, literally, because that's what leprosy was. And so these lepers are walking along. They clearly have heard of Jesus, and they cry out, "Jesus, Master," or "Mr. Jesus, help, have mercy on us." And Jesus tells them to go show themselves to the priests. Why? Well, because the priests, according to the Mosaic law, were kind of the guardians of the community when it came to skin diseases. They were the ones who determined whether you needed to be sent away because of a skin disease, and they were the ones who had the power to allow you to be rejoin the community if you were healed of this disease. So it was a bit of an act of faith that they went away to show themselves to the priests, except as they went, they were healed, and 1 out of the 10 comes back and gives thanks to Jesus. I can't help but make the parallel. It's like 1 out of 10 Christians actually goes to church on Thanksgiving Day. And the rest stay home, and maybe they say, "Let's all go around the table and say something we're thankful for." Yeah, okay, whatever. Maybe if they're a Christian family, they'll say grace, and I understand, the obligation to bring your family together. But still, it always strikes me as ironic that the one holiday that the government gives us to give thanks to the true God, a lot of Christians ignore. Right? We want to be a Christian nation, but we don't want to be Christians in the Christian nation, at least not in giving thanks to God ahead of everything. But here's the thing. This Samaritan, this half-breed, this heretic, he does that. He comes back and he falls down at Jesus' feet. Remember at the beginning, it was just Jesus, Master, but now he's worshiping Jesus. And, Jesus points out the irony. Nobody was there to give thanks except for this one guy, and he's a Samaritan. And then he tells him, go in peace. Your faith has made you well. Weren't all the others made well? Yes, they were. But this Samaritan is affirmed for his faith and for actually not only having the faith to be healed, but having the faith to come back and express his gratitude to Jesus as God, the one who heals. So that's why I'm going to be talking about recognizing God. I hope this gives you lots to chew on and that you have a great discussion. The Lord bless your study.